of the Atto di Unione was insufficient to make it legally binding in that territory. So what you have is two documents, neither of which are identical in terms, but which eventually get subsumed in the enthusiasm for political union, and that's what it comes to at the end of the day. So the next step was in January 1961, when a new Act of Union, a totally new document, was then put to the National Assembly of what by now had become the Union Parliament of the Republic of Somalia. And that was passed on the 31st of January 1961. It was made retrospective, and any lawyer will tell you that it's a fundamental principle that when you can't make laws retrospective in their application. So there are a whole series of jolly good reasons why the whole legal process was completely flawed. None of these documents was the same. And again, the same point about having contracts that match each other in their substantive details applies. The next event that then happens is that there is a referendum in the new country, and this was designed to confirm what had taken place. It was a very interesting exercise. In the former British Somaliland, 4 out of 6 electoral districts, and those held the clear majority of its population, voted to reject the new constitution, and the no vote there ranged between 60 and 72%. In Somalia, that is the former Italian Somaliland, with the exception of one district, there was a yes vote was registered, and here it ranged between 88% and 100%. Call me cynical if you like. There are some special circumstances, such as the referendum in Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands, where 98.97% of the voters have voted in favour of maintaining the status quo. But most of us in this room, I suspect, would be very incredulous of votes in the high 90s as being honest votes. So returning to, if one comes back to the plebiscite, some of the evidence available relating to electoral districts in Somalia, the Italian Somaliland, is demonstrated by one area which had a 100% yes vote. At the end of the day, Somalilanders, I think, can be forgiven for thinking that the vote in the former Italian Somaliland was bogus and had been procured by fraud and dishonesty. So at the end of this, we have a position where a union has been produced. None of the documents which purport to create that union are the same, and there is no legal document which you can actually sit down and say was approved as an act of union. We move on swiftly. In the late 1960s, a man called Siad Barre conducted a coup, and eventually in 1979 overthrew the original constitution of Somalia. A referendum was held to approve a new constitution in the late 1970s, and by the end of the 1980s the situation in Somalia had become such that his position had become extremely precarious, particularly in Somaliland itself. His response was to conduct, as you've seen from the film, a bloody, and we can now think of it as largely criminal campaign in the sense of international criminal law, a campaign against Somaliland. It was associated particularly with him and led by his brother, his son-in-law, Mohammed Said Hersi Morgan. He was the gentleman who wrote an infamous letter and report to his father-in-law. The detail of it is not important, but in that document he set out essentially what he says was a plan for the obliteration of political, military and community leadership of the people of Somaliland. There is a word for such a plan in international criminal law now in the light of jurisprudence of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and I don't want to be inflammatory, but the word is genocide. When you seek to kill the political leadership of a group of people, that is what it is. And in pursuit of that plan, you've seen the pictures, Somaliland cities and towns were indiscriminately attacked, leaving many hundreds of thousands dead, wounded, displaced, mutilated and homeless. It was a campaign that was counterproductive because in 1991 Somaliland's political leadership decided to tell the world, we've had enough of this, we are going to resume our independence. And in the 23 years since then, Somaliland has done everything it conceivably can, and which might reasonably have been expected of it, to demonstrate that it is a state and that it's acting as a responsible member of the world community. The response of the world has been essentially to ignore Somaliland. Somaliland is a state, as a matter of fact and law. There's a very good reason for it. It qualifies in any legal definition of what is a state. It doesn't need a referendum to confirm that status, but I'm sure that were they to hold a referendum, there would be a substantial vote in favour of saying, we are a state, we are independent. The answer to statehood is actually quite straightforward. The classic statement of statehood goes back to a convention signed by South American states in 1933, the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, which sets out in Article 1 what everybody now accepts to be a proper statement of what a state is. Article 1 requires that a state should possess four things: 1, a permanent population; 2, a defined territory; 3, a government; and 4, the capacity to enter into relations with other states. The European Union, interestingly, has endorsed that as an accurate statement of the law. When in the 1990s the Balkan states flew off from the centrifuge which was Yugoslavia, the question arose as to what the status of all the various new entities which had emerged was. In particular, Serbia-Montenegro, as it then was trying to assert that it was the successor state to the former Yugoslavia, not a new state, which would have given it significant advantages in the world as it sought to take its place. In the event, the European Union established a commission to deal with the issues, and it was called the Badanter Arbitration Committee, and set up by the European community in August 1991 to provide advice on the legal issues that had arisen as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia. It went on to hand down a number of opinions on the major legal questions. But in respect of this particular issue, and it's one of the most important opinions that it delivered, was to accept the Montevideo Convention as being an accurate proposition as to what makes a state. Somaliland plainly can satisfy all of the conditions. We're able to say, because of the agreements that were made internationally before independence, what the territory of Somaliland is. It is that which was recognised by 35 countries in June 1960, when for 5 days Somaliland existed as an independent state. Those borders were set and agreed, and there can be no question about them. Secondly, within those borders there is a settled and identifiable population. It's a population that's been there thousands of years. They live, work and have their being in Somaliland, and it is plainly a permanent population. Thirdly, there is clearly a government in Somaliland, and I only need to look around the room and point out to you the representatives of that government, who function and act exactly as you would expect a government to do. The finances are managed, the economy is managed, the physical infrastructure of the country is attended to, the legal infrastructure is attended to, and there are all sorts of other indications that what you have here is a state which has a government. There are courts, there's a legal system, there's a parliament, a police force and a modest military force. There's a civil service, and its people look to the government for all the things that people normally do. And indeed, one might make the proposition that there is more of a government in Somaliland than there is, because in the Palestinian question there's some doubt as to exactly how the government is formed. There's more of a government in Somaliland than there is in Palestine, which seems to be at the moment getting recognition all around the world. Finally, it has control of its foreign relations. It can and does enter into relations with foreign governments. It deals with its neighbours. whilst they may not recognise Somaliland officially, foreign governments certainly do business with it. And tomorrow, if a recognition came, the foreign minister would be out making agreements with his neighbours very promptly, I suspect. So the capacity is there. There is also the issue, and this is something that Jim Carver touched on earlier, the issue of self-determination, which needs to be put into the equation. The theory of self-determination goes back really to the United Nations Charter back in, which was when the United Nations was formed in 1945. But you may recall that in 1960, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution. It was designed to call upon, effectively, all owners of empires to get rid of their colonies as soon as possible. And much of the resolution deals with that issue. Now, Somaliland is not a colony, and was not a colony. It was an independent country in 1960. And there is Article 2 of the Declaration on Self-Determination that is clearly of general and continuing application to Somaliland. And it reads as follows: all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. I've already identified for you the fact that Somaliland has a population which is permanent. Those people are entitled to exercise the right to self-determination. They're entitled to decide for themselves how and by whom their government and how the country in which they live should be structured politically, economically, and culturally. They have the right to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, in the words of the resolution. And the refusal of states to recognise the status of Somaliland is, many may conclude, a denial of that right. Well, that's the law. The bottom line is this. Somaliland, as it stands today, is a state for the purposes of international law. Of that, I believe, there can be no doubt. Recognition, on the other hand, is a completely different thing. Recognition is a political act. And the EU Commission that I referred to earlier, the Badinter Commission, made that point exactly. Statehood doesn't depend on recognition in law, but politically it plainly does. There are some very interesting aspects to the recognition question. These are not the only ones, there are many others. But the first is this. Amongst African nations there has been qualified support for Somaliland, and when conversations have been taking place, people seem to support the aspect, the idea of recognition. But there is one particular spanner which tends to get thrown into the apple cart. One of the guiding principles of the African Union in terms of African solidarity is that there should be no recognition of international borders being changed, those international borders which were established at the end of the colonial period. Now, there's a perfectly good reason for that. Some of the colonial borders that were drawn didn't correspond with former historical realities. But nobody wanted to open up the Pandora's box of approving secessionist movements, such as the one that arose in Biafra, because that would have caused all sorts of people to start saying, oh, well, we want our little bit of our country to be a new country. That, of course, has rather gone by the board, because you now have the example of Sudan and South Sudan, and everybody has accepted that that particular division has both taken place and is a legal division, and South Sudan has become an internationally recognised country. So at a stroke, the principle of not mucking about with the former borders of countries has rather gone by the board. But the second point is that this is not a case of some secessionist movement seeking to change the borders. This is merely a return to the status ante quo, in other words, the period of 5 days recognition, in which Somaliland had a quite separate existence. In that sense, the Somaliland question is completely unique on the continent of Africa. There is nothing quite like it. This is not a case of secession. This is not a case like a Biafra. It's not a case it's not a case like Biafra. It is completely like the United Arab Republic, which some of you may remember existed between 1957 and 1961. Egypt and Syria went into a union, and then 4 or 5 years later they decided they didn't like it, and they ended the union. That is the case for Somaliland. It entered a union, it decided that it did not want to remain in the union, and has left. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the vital thing. This is not about meddling with colonial borders. This is about a marriage which has failed, and a divorce has to take place. One of the important things about getting recognition for Somaliland is, as I pointed out earlier, is its strategic position on the Horn of Africa. At the moment, Somaliland cannot advance in any sense at all. It finds it difficult to operate in the normal world. Getting development aid, getting loans, functioning as a state, it can't do any of those things. And whilst that happens, its economy can't advance, and it cannot develop its infrastructure and as a nation as everybody else does. Events in Europe in recent weeks remind us of the dangers of radical Islam, dangers that are very real for all of us. Yet here on the Horn of Africa there is a moderate Muslim state that's done all, that to all intents and purposes has behaved impeccably since 1991, when it restored its independence. It's not being allowed to develop economically, it's not being able to develop. And so it's effectively being left to moulder on the corner of Africa. The danger is that if we don't give its people the chance of progressing economically, if we deny them, continue to deny them the ability and means to develop, there is every risk that young men, firstly, young men and young women will leave the country, and it will be deprived of some of its talent. Others will then drift off to criminal gangs, and we know only too well that criminal gangs eventually get exploited by the radicals. On the other hand, Somaliland has so much to offer, and I was able with Jim Carver to go to a development conference last year, and I think both of us were absolutely staggered by the number of people who were interested players in the world of mining, oil and commerce, who wanted to find out about Somaliland and see if there was business to be done. And there are all sorts of possibilities. There are minerals, there's possibly oil, there are agricultural and horticultural possibilities. There is a potential tourist business industry. There is a major port at Berbera, which could be turned into an enormous hub for the import and export of goods into and out of neighbouring countries. Yet there is a problem. Until you recognise Somaliland, almost none of this can happen. There are some courageous souls who are already doing business, but by and large people say, yes, but you're not recognised as a country, and therefore we don't have the courage to come in and help. There is also the prospect, we know about piracy, but we also know that this is, as I've described it earlier, one of the most important bits of sea in the world. Here is an enormous port at Berbera, which, if there were difficulties in the area, could be used by naval forces from NATO to help protect shipping. If it falls into the hands of the wrong people, that port doesn't become available. Just to give you one example of the absurdity of the approach that some governments take, our own Foreign Office in the United Kingdom refuses to recognise Somaliland. It does so because the African, and this was stated by the ambassador to Ethiopia at the conference last year, it does so because it wishes to allow the African Union to make the first move. And effectively what is being said is, we will allow the African Union to determine British foreign policy. Well, there it is, ladies and gentlemen. There are enormously good reasons why recognition should take place. I think it is an unassailable case, and many of us feel the time has come to end such games.
Thank you, Michael, for such a sound opinion, legal opinion. One thing we find increasingly in the European Parliament in Strasbourg in the plenary sessions speaking about is the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. And I feel, as Michael underlined in his earlier points, a strong Somaliland, which of course is a moderate Sunni Muslim country. It is a huge opportunity for moderate Sunni Islam to lead the way. Edna spoke of the good educational facilities across Somaliland, and it strikes me that a well-educated youth who don't have the ability to fulfil their true potential, which I don't feel they do currently, with the lack of recognition of Somaliland, can often transfer, as Michael indicated, into other negative areas. So, for the very real security reasons in itself, that in itself is a very strong case, aside of the obvious and definite legal argument that was just put across so transparently by Michael. Now I'd like to invite Mohammed Dar to come up. Mohammed is the Somaliland's representative in Brussels, and I feel that it's only right that Mohammed should come up and introduce the foreign minister who will give his keynote speech. So Matt, would you like to?
Yes. Good morning. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And first of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Mohammed Bihi Yunis, the Foreign Minister and International Cooperation of Somaliland. Secondly, I would like to introduce Dr. Saad Shire, who is the Minister of Planning of Somaliland. And of course, Madam Edna, whom you know very well, and the former Foreign Minister of Somaliland, and now the President of the hospital in Hargeisa, as well as also Mr. Abdelkader, who is a hotelier, a big man in Somaliland, Mr. Ali, the representative of Somaliland to the UK, and of course all the other staff members who are taking part in this function. I don't have much to say, and I'm sorry, I made an omission. Mrs. Mademoiselle Nim'o Ilmi, who is an advisor to the minister, legal advisor to the minister. First of all, I want to thank all of you for the organization of this event, and particularly to Honorable Jim Carver and Mr. Honorable Nigel Farage, the President of the UKIP, the UK Independent Party, which we are very grateful. And also other participants, as I said, the honorable parliamentarians, the senior officials, the representative of the media. This is also welcomed, I would say, largely and enthusiastically by the Somaliland communities, not only in Belgium and Holland, but in the UK, in the United States of America, and in Canada, in Australia, where we have a huge number of people who left Somaliland some years ago. The idea and the our case has been well presented by Michael Grievous, the lawyer. I don't have much to say that much. Later on, you will hear a statement, from the Foreign Minister, Mr. Bihi, and also sometime in the afternoon, Dr. Saad Shire on the development process which is taking place in Somaliland. As a representative of Somaliland, I think I have the privilege to work closely with some of the members of parliament in Brussels, some British parliamentarians like Dr. Tannock, other honorable members of parliament, and of course those who come to know about the matter about Somaliland, support Somaliland strongly. The reason being, as has been explained amply, that how people have recovered from this carnage. It was a wasteland, to use the expression of Eliot, the American poet. It was a wasteland after the war. I went there, I remember in 1991, Hargeisa, which has now a population of nearly 1 million people, had at that time 2,000 individuals. All the people deserted the area and went and took refuge in Ethiopia. But now you would see how the people have rebuilt the country. And I think one thing which is which strikes us, even Somaliland, there is another Somalis, the decision of the former government, that dictatorial government, not only to fight against the political movements, but to start killing the civilian population, without considering whether these people were civilians, whether they were political parties and whatnot. So I think here you have a strong feeling of the people of Somaliland to control even our government. It's a participatory government. People take part in the decision-making process, not only through the parliament and the House of Representatives, elders, but really you will see how much they're much involved. A British writer was writing about Somaliland for the last few years. Brad, I forgot his name, and he said that here you have a people's project. Somaliland is a people's project, which means that, of course, the level of participation of the people in the running of the country is very high. And no government can make any decision without consulting, the Somaliland, population. As also has been stated, the present government, since 1991, not only we developed, a democratic system, which is a model, for the rest of Africa in this region, but all along we have also rebuilt, the social services, especially education, health, services, and water systems. And to conclude, my statement, I would really like again, to thank you so much for participating, in this event, and we hope, the results, at the end will be good. Thanks so much. Yes. Eventually, at last, I want to, after saying that, I want to introduce, Mr. Mohammed Bihi Yunus, the foreign minister, to deliver his statement.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, and let's also thank Michael for an eloquent statement showing that Somaliland is legally a state, and thank you very much. I think it was really excellent. But maybe before I start my statement, I would also like to share with you a personal experience on the events that took place in Somaliland. I was actually with the African Development Bank in 1988, and I was told my father and my whole family were displaced and they were in that refugee camp. So I flew from West Africa, Abidjan, the Ivory Coast, to Addis, and then took another flight to Durban, and I took a vehicle from the African Development Bank projects in Ethiopia to look for my parents and for my father and grandmother and my cousins and my family members. Actually, I went there in